In this video, I'll show you how to build one of the simplest possible sliders in JavaScript. So let's start by building a new index.html file, pressing the exclamation mark and the tab key to expand this Emmet abbreviation, and slightly organizing our code. Here I really need just some minimal updates. The src of the script tag in my HTML is going to be script.js, and I'm going to use the defer attribute here, and that's pretty much it. I'll save my changes and add script.js. Of course, script.js is where the bulk of my updates are going to take place. So first, I'm going to add a new img variable, which is going to use the document.createElement and build a new img tag. Next, I'm going to access the Pics and Photos website, and I'm going to set the src attribute on the image element to the value that I've copied over from the Pics and Photos website of this cute little dog. Then I'll use document body append child to append the img tag right here. So let's press Ctrl S to save all the changes and press the Go Live button to have my live server serving the app right here. And that's the image showing. So that takes care of the first part or of the beginning of building our slider. Next thing that I need to do is set the counter variable. Then I'll assign an empty array to the images variable. Let me also close this. And now I'll add a for loop, which will basically populate the images array by using the push method to push as many images as needed from the Pics and Photos website based on the number of loops this for loop will perform. Since the I starts at 0 and I is less than 3, that means that it will add 3 images to the images array. Next, I'll add a next slide function, and the next slide function has two things that it needs to perform. First, it needs to update the src attribute on the image element by accessing the images array and then the index or the item based on the current value of the counter. Next, I'm going to determine if the counter is less than images.length minus 1. And if this comparison returns true, then I want to increase the value of the counter by 1. Otherwise, I want to reset the counter to 0. And then I'm going to run set timeout, where I'm going to keep repeating the next slide function. Finally, to get things into motion, I'll invoke the next slide function, and this update now serves the most basic slider. Of course, although this does work, there are a few things that we could improve. For example, we could add the slider buttons like left and right arrows. We could add counter indicators, those little circles indicated where we're at and how many images there are in total. We could add the ability to add text to each of our slides. We could make our slides swipeable or mobile friendly. We could make our slider responsive so that it can adjust to different resolutions. And we could do many other things, other ways that we could improve our slider. Things can get quite complex as we add more functionality, and that's why there are so many different plug-and-play slider solutions out there. However, since we're interested in coming up with our own, let's make some further updates to this most basic slider. I'm going to begin by adding the slider buttons, those left and right arrows. So right here in the body, I'm going to add a div. Inside this div, I'm going to add a button with the name of left. and onClick is going to execute the prev slide method. I'm going also to set the ID to prev, and the value inside the button will be previous. And now let's just format that a little bit. And now I'll copy what I just typed up and add the second button. This one's going to have the name of right. The onClick is going to be next slide. The ID is going to be next. And here I'll just use the word next. All right, so I've got the previous and the next buttons. Maybe I can make this one shorter so that they fit both nicely. Prev and next. And that's as far as the HTML updates go. The next thing that I'm going to do is essentially turn off the automatic slide update. And I'm going to do that by simply commenting out the set timeout. And now let's try. The prev obviously doesn't work because it hasn't been defined, but will the next slide function work as it is? Let's give it a try. So if I keep on pressing the next key, I get my images updating. So that's pretty cool. So now that I know that the slider is no longer looping infinitely using the set timeout, I can actually remove it. And I can also console log the value of the counter variable, because that's really the variable that helps me keep track of what is happening. So let's see what happens when I click next now. So basically it starts with a 0, then I have 1, 2, then again when I get the first image it starts again at 0, and it keeps on looping 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, so that gives me an idea of what I want to have happen when I code the next function. The next function is going to be named prevSlide. So the prevSlide function needs to do the opposite of what the next slide function is doing. So let me start by making sure that the prevSlide function can actually do the opposite update to the counter variable than what I have in the next slide function. So I'm checking if the counter is less than 3 and greater than 0. And if that's the case, then whenever the user presses the prev button, that's going to trigger the previous slide. So then I want to lower the value of the counter variable. Otherwise, if the value of the counter variable is outside of this range, then I want to set the counter to 2. So I'm basically resetting it the same way that I'm resetting it here. And now that I've done that, let me also console log the value of the counter variable right here. And let's see what that does. So when I press next, both the value of the counter is updated and console logged, and also the image is updated accordingly. If I press the prev key, then I get 210, 210, so that works as well. So let me update the prev slide so that the click also triggers the showing of the proper image in my slider. So now let's also add some more console logging. Namely, I'm going to say console log, let's say console.log starting to run previous slide. Counter was counter, so I'm interested in the previous value of the counter before it starts working. Then I'm going to say if counter is less than or equal to a 0, I want to set the counter to the images.length -1. Otherwise, I'm going to set the counter to counter -. So what I'm doing here is just a bit more advanced logic, which you hopefully can still grasp. And now I'm also going to console log another more descriptive explanation of what is happening. And that is that I'm basically finished running pref slide, and counter now is at counter. And finally, I need to update the document, well, not the document, but the imgsrc to images counter. Cool. So here's my saved update. And now perhaps I could also do the console log for the next slide. Maybe this feels redundant, but it's going to be really helpful in confirming what is happening. So starting to run next slide and finished running next slide. Counter is counter. So starting to run next slide, counter was 0. Finish running next slide, counter is counter. So initially, the next slide function is ran because that's what we have here. So let's also remove that and just save our changes. And now we start with this dog image without any console logs. So when I press the next button, starting to run next slide, counter was 0. Finish running next slide, counter is 1. Let's just see if everything still works. What about the previous slider method? Images is not defined. So obviously I made a mistake here. And let's do this again. So previous shows the dandelion, then the skyscrapers, and then the dogs. So our counter is now responding to button clicks.